Custom Robo is a series that is now mostly forgotten, though it was also never really that big to start with. It probably only even gets mentioned because it was published by Nintendo. It's the sort of series that wasn't really uncommon at the time. The series that burned short but brightly, making a strong impression with the fans they did find, even if the overall reception wasn't the best. Custom Robo is a series that inspires a lot of love in its fans, even if it never found quite as wide of an audience as it deserves. So let's try and find it even a small piece of that audience, even if it's a little too late. Custom Robo may just be Nintendo's best forgotten franchise. It's certainly my favorite. Custom Robo is a series made of 3 components. The gameplay of an arena fighter, possibly being one of the earlier examples, customization mechanics typical of an action RPG or mecha game, and the story typical of a toy battling anime. For combat, battles are fought in 3D arenas called Holosseums. You can run, jump, air dash or air jump, fire any of 3 different weapons, your gun, bomb, and pod, and you can use a charge melee attack. That's the limit of the verbs you've got. Like many of the best action games, it relies on a simple pool of actions that can be combined together to create a combat system that is accessible for newcomers, but has plenty of room for expression and skill as advanced players learn to use everything together. Running, jumping, and air dashing or air jumping don't really need explanations, so I'm going to focus on the weapons here. Guns are generally the strongest weapons and possess auto-aim and homing properties. Plus, some guns have alternate fire modes when you're in the air versus when you're on the ground. You might think this would make them all you would ever use, but since there's no hit scan in this game, everything can be dodged, and guns tend to be very predictable. Aside from timing them to your opponent's action, the defender essentially has full control over whether or not a gun attack actually hits them. There's no ability to lead your target or the like. They also tend to have the most firing lag, both starting and ending, so a poorly timed gunshot can do more to help your opponent hit you than anything. Furthermore, if you're trading gunfire and you get downed by your opponent, all your bullets disappear harmlessly. So without a good setup, there's only so much gunfire can do on its own. Guns still tend to be the centerpiece of whatever build you're using, but they need to be properly supported to reach their full potential. Bombs, meanwhile, have to be manually aimed. Hold down the button and your movement controls will instead move the aiming reticule and then release to fire at any point on the map. That said, the reticule always starts near the opponent, so it's easy to reliably lob them in the right area. They usually fly in an arc and leave explosions that linger for a short while. They're mostly used to wall off your opponent so that they either blunder into your bomb or have less room to dodge your gunfire. Alternatively, they can often be a relatively safe option to keep applying pressure from behind cover. With the exception of a few particularly strong ones, bombs do tend to be the hardest weapons to use, but they're still extremely vital to getting the most out of your Robo. Lastly, the back-mounted pods are sort of a middle ground. Nearly as varied as guns, but like bombs, they're generally more oriented towards trapping opponents. But they do have the unique advantage that they can be aimed by moving, and they also fire instantly, making them the easiest weapon to throw out regardless of your circumstances. Some pods, like the speed and cockroach pods, function best as direct pressure tools, giving you an option for builds using more oddball guns. Others, like the Seeker pods, are great for chasing enemies out of cover, especially on builds that can't effectively use bombs for this purpose. Then there's the Spider and Satellite pods, plus their freeze counterparts, which function as mines to cut off parts of the map. Pods often end up being the last piece I decide on for most of my builds, but at the same time, they often tend to be where everything really comes together, since they tend to be all about battlefield control. It's the combination of these aspects that make a lot of the gameplay work. Honestly, sometimes it can border on bullet hell, with both you and your opponent throwing stuff everywhere, trying to keep the pressure on while using your movement abilities, your knowledge of the opponent's weapons, and the arena itself to both survive and land hits on your opponent. Hammer them enough and you can knock them down, giving you a chance to pile on even more damage. But when a robot recovers from being down, they get a window of invincibility, so you can be punished if you get too aggressive here. It definitely hits the right notes you would expect from a good arena fighter. You and your opponent fighting for positioning and trying to get in a hit, then capitalize on the momentum in an explosive burst of damage before breaking off to avoid getting punished. It's that perfect mix of knowledge, reflexes, and instinct that drives some of the best action games. In addition to these main weapons, you also have a charge attack, which is tied to the body of your robo, and they're quite varied, if usually a little bit niche. There's straightforward tackles that make for powerful offensive options, albeit with limited range. There's defensive charges that excel at getting you out of a tight situation, and other charges geared more for movement or attacking in certain positions. While the charge attack is only one aspect of a robo's effect on your overall performance, they add a nice bit of distinction and a unique option that can be very impactful if used right. Landing a charge tends to be high impact, especially if the enemy wasn't already downed. And of course, there is the Holosseums, which also affect the battle, though not as deeply as you might think. Most of them are some form of different patterns of walls. They add variety, but only a few oddball stages really shake up the gameplay that much. The game would certainly be lesser if it only had one, though. But combat is only one part of what makes this series great. There's also customization, the custom in Custom Robo. This series definitely is an Armored Core, it's nowhere near that elaborate, and there's no headache-inducing walls of numbers here. Though honestly, maybe the games could use slightly more numbers. You only give rough estimates of how parts perform, and many stats, like a robo's attack power modifier, are often left off entirely. It definitely could have been nice if the game communicated some of these better. But at the same time, this still is Custom Robo, not Armored Core. You can mostly work out a good build by feel. While calling it Armored Core for kids might be a fun way to be laconic and reductive with it, Custom Robo is really a completely different flavor of customizable mech game, and the customization works brilliantly for what it is designed to be. Any serious comparisons to Armored Core or other such mech games would really be missing the point. I already went over what the different weapon types do in the combat section, but of course when building your robo it's important to factor in how they fit together. You can focus on combos with weapons that naturally chain from one to another. You can focus on coverage with weapons that address every range and situation to keep the pressure on your enemy. Or you can focus on using your bomb and pod to set up enemies for a particularly powerful gun. Or maybe even focus everything around a theme to counter a specific enemy or battlefield, like focusing on anti-air weapons or weapons that can easily fire around walls. There's as many possibilities as there are parts. Of course, the part with the most individual depth is the robo body, since it determines more than just a single attack like your weapons do. Determines your speed on the ground or in the air, how your air jumps or dashes work, what your charge attack does, how much damage you deal and take, and how easy you are to knock down. While most of the time perhaps not as critical as your weapons, the right robo can make a huge difference in how you play, and the wrong robo can make certain builds rather unviable. Maybe the best way is to just list out the different models, but do note that there's also different types within each class, usually having minor stat differences and different charge attacks. Firstly, there's the Shining Fighter robos, which include the Ray line that are this series' mascots. And Shining Fighters are well-rounded robos with no real strengths and weaknesses, and they get 2 air dashes. In most games, you're stuck with one of them for a while, or in V1's case, the entirety of the story mode. But they're well-rounded enough that this doesn't really matter too much. It's a good training period before you can graduate to more specialized robos. They can work with nearly anything, even if they're often outclassed by other robos for more focused builds. Meanwhile, aerial beauties are similarly well-rounded, with air jumps and a focus on mid-air mobility, as their name might suggest. Air jumps don't have the same speed as air dashes most of the time, but they do provide way better control and vertical mobility. This gives aerial beauties fantastic air time and control with which to attack from above. Getting more specialized now, Little Raider and Little Sprinter models are fast with small frames that make them difficult to hit, but they do tend to instantly get knocked down by most attacks. And on top of that, they have lower attack and defense to further balance out their spectacular mobility. They can be incredibly annoying with the right build, but used poorly, they're cannon fodder. Metal Grappler units, meanwhile, are the opposite. They're big, easy targets, but can take and give hits with ease. They have a single air dash with a surprisingly good amount of thrust too, so they're not quite slow. Great for aggressive, in-your-face builds that want to put out a lot of fire. Lastly, we have a couple of the more exotic models. Strike Vanishers are similar to Shining Fighters, but trade lower stats for invisible air dashes that let them avoid certain attacks and move quite aggressively. Similarly, Lightning Sky Robos are also fairly well-rounded, albeit slower on the ground, and have a unique air dash that lets them transform and glide through the air for a distance, during which they can fire weapons while moving and turn mid-dash. As you can tell, Robos are very diverse in their capabilities and open up all sorts of possibilities. It's definitely a shame that the original custom Robo didn't let you change Robos in the main story mode. But lastly, leg parts are the most easily overlooked, providing refinements to how your Robo moves. Most of them come with some sort of trade-off, not that the English games actually tend to mention these very well. But the right legs can work wonders, even if it's subtle things like improved movement control or reduced landing lag. Maybe the best way to show just how impressive the customization can be is to share some of my own creations. In Custom Robo V1, my build was centered around the sniper gun, a single-shot weapon with a fast, powerful bullet but a long period between attacks. To cover this, I used the spider pod to lay mines, along with a bomb that was good for cutting enemies off. Both pod and bomb also had a blast type that launches enemies up, and so with good timing, a hit from these made for an almost certain direct hit from the sniper gun too. Because this was V1, I was limited to just using the ray, but it worked out. Then when V2 came along, I used the Javelin Strike Vanisher. It just felt right since it had plot significance, and the Strike Vanisher type was newly added in V2. One of my two builds in this game used the shotgun, either close in quickly with the stealth dash or set them up with the freeze bomb or sky freeze pod, blast them with the shotgun for a lot of damage and an instant down, then use the javelin's quick charge to rack up damage. Alternatively, I used the same Robo with the Rayfall gun, Seeker pod, and Geotrap bomb. This one much more focused on gradually grinding down the enemies, with a combination of suppressing and trapping options. And of course the stealth dash was great for playing keep away. For Battle Revolution, okay, I used the Ray 01 with a pulse gun a lot, since they're kind of fun for being a Gatling gun that can hook around obstacles effectively, and also I think the pulse guns are a rare part that's exclusive to this game. I also experimented with the Swift Robo a bit, and eventually settled on the needle gun with that one. If these seem uselessly vague, honestly I was never fully happy with my setup in the game, since it's so stingy with parts until the grand battle. As for Arena, this also gets complicated, since this is the game that finally let you save different builds, a feature that was sorely missing, so I've got a lot of different builds in this one. So let's see. Oh, and this is all just from my recent playthrough of this game. My main build used a power-type Sassy Stunner Robo focused on an aggressive playstyle. The flare gun is straightforward and flexible, and incredibly powerful if I manage to hit the sweet spot on it. The Winder Bomb, whatever, fires 3 shots in a row that are great for chasing out enemies and also fairly reliable at landing hits compared to many other bombs. And then with 2 very reliable weapons, I was able to choose a more niche pod, the Buster Pod. Mostly kind of a random choice, but it has a few perks. Mostly being able to combo with the charge attack on my Robo, especially on a downed foe, for plenty of damage. Thanks to the buffs that Custom Robo Arena Redux provided to this class of Robo, this wound up a very fun and mobile glass cannon build. My next build used a power-type Lightning Sky model. The direct bomb, which fires more like a gun, simply because it's nice to not have to aim when using the Sky Dash. Most bombs tend to be hard to use on Lightning Sky models. Along with Seeker Pods, since they can be thrown out and stick around for a while, so they're great for fire and forget. And then I kind of shifted around with a different gun every now and then, but usually something that's held back by a long recovery time or slow projectiles. Oh, and the +1 legs for the second dash that works so damn well on Lightning Sky Robos. Thirdly, I had a speed-type Aerial Beauty model with the Dragon Gun, focused on spamming the high-power, high-homing shots from high up and out of the enemy's reach. To help with this, the build uses the Delta Bomb, a bomb with 3 tall pillar-like blasts that excel at cutting off enemy movement, and the Ground Freeze Pod, a pod that can deploy up to 2 units that lie in wait on the ground before moving in and hitting with a freezing effect, a great setup for the powerful Dragon Gun. And then, just because it illustrates a specific way you can use customization, after dealing with some very frustrating enemy Lightning Sky models, I created a build with the Ray Mark III, the power-type Shining Fighter, and went all in on anti-air weapons. Sky Freeze Pods to set up the enemy and limit their movement, the Needle Gun for easy air shots, and the Smash Bomb for being a quick, mid-range anti-air weapon. Plus the Smash Bomb also makes a great combo tool. A little hyper-specialized, but it absolutely did its job. It pretty much demolishes the Lightning Sky Robos that were getting on my nerves. Honestly, I could go on, but we'd be here for a while. Point is that the customization in these games is pretty great, and you'll certainly never want for options. You know, I feel like custom Robo model kits would have been awesome. Buying different sets and mix and matching parts to create the Robos you've got in the game. Could even make them 1:1 scale too. Wouldn't that be cool? As for other stuff, well, the story tends to be pretty standard shonen toy battle anime stuff. Do they still have those kinds of anime these days, besides like Yu-Gi-Oh! That's been on since I was a kid? Look, when these games were being made, these kinds of anime were everywhere. If you're familiar, you know the drill. It's based around some marketable concept, in this case custom robo battles. Usually in the case of the anime, this would be some toy that you could buy. And the main character wants to be the very best at this thing, like no one ever was. So they do the thing a lot, win tournaments, and at some point the plot then derails into dealing with a criminal organization that wants to use the thing the series is based on to do crimes, no matter how little sense this may make. And then you finish up the tournament arc. That's basically the whole series except the GameCube title, which I'll get into later. In fact, at V1, the plot is basically just this, with very basic archetypes for the characters. It reads more like a rough draft. But in either case, the story modes tend to be quite linear, just sort of a way to throw progressively harder fights at you until you're good at the game. Although starting with V2, the games did tend to have fairly beefy post-game grand battle modes that are more open and have a lot more content to enjoy. Oh, and the music is pretty reliably awesome too. You know what, let's just do a little jam session like we did in the RPG video last month. As for how the series progressed, honestly the most shocking thing about playing the first game was how little first game weirdness there was. Look, if you're into older games, you know the feeling, right? You go back to play an early installment in a favorite series for the first time, and you're gonna find something weird. And I don't mean that in a bad way either. It's one of my favorite parts of playing older games. Seeing what people tried before the industry became much more safe. It's especially true if you're playing something from the PS1 or N64, since that's when games were still coming to grips with being in 3D. But Custom Robo V1 had almost none of that. It plays almost identically to any of its sequels, just maybe slightly clunkier and control scheme's a little weirder, but it's all very minor stuff. While the series does have some changes over time, they nailed the core of the experience the first time, and so it kind of feels very iterative as a result. It's an awkward spot to be in. Getting something so right that you can't really go much higher from there. But since the combat stays mostly the same from game to game, the biggest changes you'll see are around the part system. Outside of Arena, you get new parts by defeating opponents and then going to a parts generator machine. In V1 and V2, you get parts that the enemy had equipped. Anything you don't have, it's yours now. Well, except for the Robo itself. In V1, this works fine. There's not a ton of parts, and it ends up ultimately keeping pace fairly well. In V2, meanwhile, the game just loves denying you new parts. Many battles will keep you from generating new parts even early on, or at very least lock you into just getting the enemy Robo, since you can only get Robos from special battles, and these specific battles only give you the Robo, not any of the other parts. It makes V2 kind of frustrating in the early game, like you're always missing out on something. It gets better by the end, where, ironically, it then reverses and there's not much new for you to get. While V1 did occasionally have battles where you couldn't get parts, these were much rarer in the first game. Then, by Battle Revolution, the parts you get are only sometimes related to the enemy you just fought, making the early game part supply feel even more restrictive. Heck, by the end of the main story, I had under half of the available legal gun parts. The rest are locked in the Grand Battle post-game. But this all changed in Custom Robo Arena, which added shops to buy parts. Money is earned from battles based on the newly added ranking system, which is based on how quick you beat the opponent, how much damage you take, and what your best combo is. While this can result in a slow start, especially if you're new to the series and thus not getting good ranks and good payouts, at least you get to choose what you get, so you're usually able to get something you like sooner. And it also means that they don't have to hold back a ton of parts until the grand battle. All of the legal parts are available by the end game, but anything you don't pick up can always be bought during the grand battle. But really, there are two much bigger changes to how parts work. First, V2 let you use robos other than the Ray in the story mode, which was a huge improvement. You only got one of each category during the main story, but it was still a huge step up. Not to mention giving the player access to any robo means they could get a lot more creative with what robos did, like adding the Strike Vanishers in V2 or adding the Lightning Sky models later on in the series. But even without more exotic robos, a game called Custom Robo just was never going to reach its full potential if it kept locking you into a single robo during the story modes. And the second change to the part system is that, of course, each installment adds more parts and even things like more classes of robos. By the last game in the series, there were a huge number of options to choose from. And making it even better is that they almost never removed parts either, except for illegal parts and specific robos. In the former case, it doesn't matter as much since acquiring those tends to be a post-game bonus, and they're generally upgraded versions of common parts anyway. I mean, it would be nice to have all the illegal parts, but it would only be a neat bonus thing and wouldn't affect the main story of the game. Meanwhile, the specific robos within each class are pretty interchangeable. Usually you'll still functionally have all the same robos, even if they look and have some minor differences. At very least, you'll basically always have like a power, speed, and defense in each class. As a result, while there are some exceptions, the parts lists are almost entirely the same as the last one, but with more added. Oh, and I may as well mention, since I don't have anywhere else to put this, that the same applies to Holosseums in a lot of cases too. So you'll have the same places to do battle as well, and the same tools to do battle with. It's kind of part of why I consider Arena to be the best in the series, just because it has the most content. With all that said though, I think I do have a little more to talk about with regards to the last two games. The first games were pretty bare bones after all. V2 really does just feel like version 2, more of an upgraded re-release than a whole new title. But the later ones did try to put their own spin on the series. Battle Revolution definitely stands out the most at a glance. It is to Custom Robo what 5Ds was to Yu-Gi-Oh! The one that takes a story mostly about a kid's game that occasionally makes it strangely important, and then just makes all of society focus on it in a way that should be absurd, but is actually kind of awesome. This is a world where robos are everywhere, used by criminals, cops, and bounty hunters, as well as for recreational battles. There's the reason for all of this, but for the most part, the game actually does take it pretty seriously. Although, despite what you might expect from this being the quote-unquote serious one, the game isn't really dark and edgy or anything like that. There's a ton of goofy moments, and if anything, I spend more time laughing here than in any other game. Really, it's just that it has the most attention placed on the story. It's definitely my favorite. It discards the be the very best plotline in favor of your character working as a bounty hunter and gradually being pulled into a much more compelling story than the simple criminal plots of the other titles. There were also comics that ran in Nintendo Power across 3 issues that teased us with something even more interesting. It's ultimately totally unrelated to anything in the game, unfortunately, but this really is the game that tried the hardest with its story, and I appreciate it for it. While I wouldn't quite say that it's worth playing just for the story, the fact that it does have the attention put on the story helps it stand out compared to its siblings. It's really nice if you're playing a bunch of the games in succession, as I have, to have the game stand out in a unique way. But while the story is good, the thing I love most here is just the sheer visual style of it all. Considering that the other games were on the N64 and DS, they were limited in what they could do visually, but Battle Revolution leverages the full power of the GameCube. Everything is gorgeous, from the character design with their wild cyberpunk fashion and the bright colors and simple textures, which age a lot more gracefully than trying to be realistic, to the sleek and shiny robo designs that look particularly mechanical compared to the other games, or the futuristic world realized in beautiful 3D. Not to mention the redesigned Holosseums have this fantastic cyberspace look to them. For some reason, this game and Pokemon Colosseum are just peak GameCube aesthetic for me. Takes me back to when we still thought the future would be awesome and look this cool. Might as well also mention a few other minor things. Firstly, it's the only game with 4 robo battles. I think it might be an option in V2 as well, but they never show up in the main story there. It's a pretty neat gimmick here, but I wouldn't say they're more than that. 1v1s can get chaotic enough, so 2v2s are a complete mess. Also, you can set your robo to be different colors. I just think this is a neat touch that gives you a small bit of visual customization that the series has never really had. Arena, meanwhile, is probably the only game to really try and move the series forward mechanically. There's a much greater focus on the story mode for one. It's a lot longer and structured more like a proper RPG. There's side content to do, shops and optional battles, a lot more NPCs to talk to, even stuff that qualifies as full-on side quests. Plus now there's mission battles that put special conditions on the fight to spice things up and force you to adapt. And of course, as mentioned earlier, there's shops to buy parts in now. While all the other games did have world maps and the ability to walk around, this is where it feels like it finally serves a purpose. Sure, one could argue that most of the stuff here is just unnecessary filler, but I mean, Custom Robo is a game that is about the gameplay of the Robo matches, not about progression or completion. So being able to leisurely screw around and engage in unnecessary robo battles just kind of works out. You never have to do it or anything unless you're desperate for parts money. Meanwhile, in battle, there's Soul Boost, a super mode introduced midway through the game that adds basically nothing. It's just a power boost, you can only use it every few matches, and it's just strong enough to be frustrating in enemy hands, but never quite game-changing. It mostly just forces you to play a bit more defensive when the enemy uses it, and gives you the option to pile on a bit more damage if you can get the momentum. It would have been nice if they had more interesting effects, or even a variety of possible effects. Maybe give each category of robo its own unique soul boost suited to it. It's here, and it's one of the few changes they make to the core gameplay, so I kind of have to talk about it. While we're on the topic of gameplay, I will say it is really impressive that the game never really feels restricted in its controls, despite having a D-pad instead of an analog stick. Maybe it's just that I grew up with the game and it's the first one in the series I played, so I'm used to it. But to me at least, it never feels like much of an issue. Let's see. Another minor mechanic is that robos get dirty and need to be polished on the touchscreen. It's either annoying or something you don't care about. I never really cared that much about it, but if the best reaction it can get is indifference, yeah, it's probably a net negative. Meanwhile, one of the better minor additions is undeniably the dioramas. You get to pose your robo with the touchscreen, and I just freaking love doing this. It lets you have a little extra ownership over your robos. Also, it comes with, finally, being able to save loadouts. Honestly, that was a huge barrier to realizing the potential for customization in the previous games. Also, I would add that just being on a handheld makes the game much better for multiplayer. As I discussed in my previous video, handhelds were great for games with more complex multiplayer. Custom Robo is not a party fighter. You can't just sit someone down on your sofa and expect them to grasp all the nuances of customization and battle. You need another player familiar with the series, ideally one with their own Robo ready to go. So the DS is perfect for this, focusing multiplayer as being between two equal parties. And this is also where online play was added to the series, just in case you don't have anyone around to play with. I remember having a good time with it back in the day. And lastly, Custom Robo Arena managed to balance the story nicely, finding a good middle ground between the silly shonen toy battle anime of the first two games and the more serious story of Battle Revolution. Robos are used frequently for a variety of purposes, some industrial, sometimes for both criminal and law enforcement purposes, and this all kind of makes sense when considering the abilities they're stated to have. I mean, it's still kind of a little silly to be allowing kids to run around with these things, but honestly, even saying that makes me feel disingenuous, since that's pretty normal for these kinds of stories. See Pokemon for an evergreen example. So the game's very gradual development kind of puts them in a weird spot. While I think having the first two games leave Japan might have been nice, after all, the N64 always felt to me like a console with a somewhat limited library, so any extra variety is appreciated there. In some ways, maybe it's better we didn't get them. We got to experience the best games in the series, but we got to experience them totally fresh and without being bogged down by the fact that they didn't innovate that much on the first two. And really, they released late in the lifespan of the N64, so maybe they thought it was just hard to justify bringing them over with the GameCube right around the corner. There's a lot of titles that never made it westward just because they were too close to a console generation change. That said, Battle Revolution should totally have made it to Europe, though. They got robbed. Even if they did at least get Arena, the best title in the series. So if you want to get into Custom Robo, just go straight to Arena. It's the most complete and accessible game. Though I will say that Battle Revolution is good too, and its main story is much shorter. You can easily get it done in a day or two, so if that's a perk to you, maybe you're better off starting there. Otherwise, play Arena for the most polish, Battle Revolution for the ultra-slick GameCube aesthetic, then play the other ones when you just want more Custom Robo. V1 and V2 are really impressive for N64 games, but there's not really any reason to prioritize playing these over their sequels. And, well, that's it. That's all for Custom Robo games. Wait, what do you mean there's a GBA game? How would that even work? Well, okay, fine, but after my time with V2, I don't really feel like stumbling through one of these untranslated. It's hard to customize when I need to hold my phone up to the screen to remember what things do. Wait, what do you mean there's a translation patch that released while I was working on the video? No way, that timing's too perfect. Stop talking to myself and get on with it? Okay. Well then, Custom Robo GX. The weird GBA spin-off of Custom Robo. Combat takes a side-scrolling perspective, creating a lot more verticality than you typically see in Custom Robo. Of course, it is in 2D. Robos can fly freely, they don't need to jump, and can air dash in any direction while flying. It does feel like a pretty solid 2D demake of Custom Robo's gameplay, but it's also a lot rougher. Sometimes you get caught on walls, and it feels like the hit stun is particularly harsh and unpleasant in this game. Combined with the very floaty, rough physics and generally slower action, and trading blows with your opponent doesn't feel nearly as good. It's not bad, but it's clear that they did not nail it in one like they did with the main series combat. Customization is overall quite similar, but where the game does lose some depth without the tight 3D movement, it does try to make up with more complexity in the parts system. Guns and bombs are mostly pretty similar to their main series counterparts with some minor changes. Guns now have an alternate fire with R plus B. For some guns, this serves as a substitute for how they would have different air and grounded shots in the mainline games. But the overall effect is that guns are a bit more varied, if also a bit more complicated to use. Bombs, meanwhile, lose their ability to be manually aimed, but otherwise do seem to perform better. Their explosions linger for longer and are much more of a problem to deal with, not to mention that they do seem to hit quite hard compared to their main series counterparts. Some guns and bombs also have the ability to shoot through walls. Typically, this serves as a replacement for weapons that could easily fire over walls in the 3D games. The Rayfall gun's primary fire and the standard bomb, for instance, both have this property. Pods, meanwhile, get more significant changes. Instead of a pod slot, you have a sub-weapon slot. It can be equipped with traditional pods, which work as expected and include classics like the Seeker and Speed pods, along with options like the reworked satellite pods that orbit your robo. But alternatively, the sub-weapon slot can be used to equip various remote gunner units with a variety of behaviors. Some stay where they're deployed, others pursue the opponent, and on top of this they all come in a variety of firing patterns. Also, the charge functionality has been replaced with an action chip. The default is a horizontal tackle, very similar to the charges of old, and some others function similarly to old charges, such as a vertical variant of the tackle, although there are a few others. I really do think the action chip would be a cool addition to mainline custom robo, although in exchange GX also lacks leg parts, I guess just because the movement is vastly simplified compared to all of the intricacies that legs directly interacted with in the main series. As for other parts, well, Colosseums are much more important since walls get in the way a lot more often without the ability to just go over them. The structure of the game seems pretty simple though, just play through tournament after tournament, which to be fair also describes V1. At least in GX it's a little more fleshed out because you can replay tournaments to get money and stuff. It's pretty much where Custom Robo started to experiment more with being an RPG, which we'd see later in Arena. I guess they just didn't feel like doing any of these more RPG features for Battle Revolution. Visually, though, the game is pretty basic. There's a little world map, and the dialogue is all done in a visual novel style presentation, which honestly these visual novel bits feel more like a Game Boy Color game to my eyes, with regards to the character sprites feeling like they have rather limited color palettes, and also the design of the text boxes, though maybe it's just that they went for a more washed out style so it would look better on the original GBA that didn't have backlighting. But Custom Robo GX is interesting. It actually introduced several things that would be later introduced into the main series games, such as Lightning Sky Robos and using a shop to get parts from. But GX also has a lot of ideas that sadly were not included in later games. I would have loved to see action chips and see gunner units alongside pods in a mainline Custom Robo game. And I'm probably missing some few things. I didn't really talk about robos, for instance, but also I'm just not quite going to put in the effort to play through the game just yet. It's not quite as fun as the other games, and I'm sure there's a lot missing because the translation patch is pretty bare bones at this point. I still really appreciate the work that's been done on it. They translated the mechanical stuff that you need to know to be able to play the game. So I think they were right to release it in this currently kind of incomplete state. I'm just not as interested in playing through it without a complete translation patch. But even if I don't really have the drive to play through it all right now, I wanted to at least mention it, both in order to make sure the video is actually kind of complete, and because I think the game has a lot of interesting and unique features that are worth talking about. When custom robo games were being released, they tended to get pretty average reviews. And then this all ended with the abysmal sales of Custom Robo Arena, selling less than 200,000 units overall and only around 30,000 units in North America and Europe combined. All especially devastating considering the popularity of the DS and the fact that Custom Robo Arena did so poorly despite being one of the more impressive games on the platform and probably the best game in the franchise. So when you look at these sales, it's not really a huge surprise we haven't gotten anything since. Maybe it never really found its audience, or maybe its audience was just never going to be large enough. It doesn't help that it doesn't really feel like a lot of other Nintendo stuff, which maybe contributed to this. Robots shooting each other with guns and bombs isn't really what you think of when you think Nintendo, unless you're thinking of Metroid, even if these are toys. Oh, maybe it's growing up with stuff like Custom Robo Arena that made me so fond of the niche and the unusual, and maybe it's why I prefer these sorts of games that are a 7 out of 10 to most people, but are a 10 out of 10 to the people they're perfect for. But regardless, I really do believe these games deserve more appreciation, so if you haven't tried them, maybe give them a look. Or if you're already familiar with the series, why not go back and try some of the other games? You won't find too many surprises, except perhaps Battle Revolution and GX, but when a series is dormant like this, sometimes more of the same is all you need. Custom Robo got everything right the first time, pretty much, so it never really had room to do anything more than iterating. The end result is a short-lived series that, I guess, is exactly as long as it needed to be. An unsung great of this era of video games where things like this weren't that uncommon. Originally, there was going to be a section in this video talking about how I'd revive the series, but besides the fact that this video is already an unexpectedly monstrous one, I just didn't think it was necessary. Sure, I could pontificate and I have ideas, but, well, for one, it probably isn't happening, and two, I feel like for a mostly iterative series like this, it feels a little too bold to make crazy suggestions. Ultimately, I kind of just shrug and say, hey, if somehow we got a Custom Robo 5, maybe they could have more stuff from GX. But really, I'd just like to see re-releases of Arena and Battle Revolution so more people can play them. The series deserves another chance, but, well, if they don't give us a way to play the games legitimately, well, it's up to you to find another way, I suppose. This is Mikhail, signing off.